When a black veteran walked into a small-town diner and ordered a steak, he expected nothing more than a hot meal and a moment of peace. But when the young waitress leaned in and whispered a few quiet words, the entire room went silent. What he heard shook him to his core. James Carter had driven for hours. The hum of the road, the only thing keeping him company. The sky above was a dull gray, heavy with the promise of rain, and the landscape rolled by like a faded memory. Empty fields, weathered barns, and the occasional gas station that had seen better days. He didn't mind the silence. In fact, he preferred it. After 68 years of life and 2 tours overseas, James had learned how to find comfort in stillness. Today wasn't just any day, it was the anniversary of his wife's passing, and he had just visited her grave, like he did every year. He left her flowers, whispered a few words only she would understand, then quietly returned to his truck and started driving with no clear destination in mind. As the afternoon stretched on and the clouds thickened, his stomach reminded him it had been a while since he'd eaten. Just outside a small southern town, he spotted a roadside diner. It looked old and forgotten, with chipped paint and a crooked neon sign that flickered more than it shone. Still, something about it felt familiar, even welcoming in its own worn-down way. James pulled into the gravel lot, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment. He'd been in hundreds of places like this before, places where a man like him sometimes wasn't entirely welcome. But he was tired, and he needed a hot meal. That was all. As he pushed open the diner door, a small bell jingled overhead. The low murmur of conversation dipped slightly, just for a moment, as a few heads turned his way. James felt the familiar prickle on the back of his neck, people noticing, but not speaking. He didn't blame them, not really. He'd lived long enough to know that sometimes silence spoke louder than words. He kept his shoulders square and his gaze steady as he walked past the booths and took a seat at a small table near the window. A young waitress approached with a notepad and a soft, polite smile. She looked like she'd been on her feet for too many hours, but she had kind eyes and a quiet calm about her. "What can I get you, sir?" she asked. Her voice was gentle, without judgment, and James nodded once. "I'll take the steak medium, if it's any good. And a coffee. Black, you got it," she said, jotting it down. "Steak's pretty decent. I'll be right back with your coffee." As she walked away, James looked around the room. It was small, with wood-paneled walls and red vinyl booths. A few families sat talking softly. An old couple near the counter shared a slice of pie, nothing special. Just a quiet slice of life, but still, he could feel the eyes on him now and then. Maybe curiosity. Maybe something else. James wasn't looking for trouble. He'd faced enough of that overseas. All he wanted now was a little peace and a hot meal. When the waitress returned with his coffee, she refilled the cup with a steady hand and gave him a brief smile. Her name tag read Emily. She didn't ask questions. She didn't treat him differently. That, more than anything, made James relax a little. He sipped the coffee, warm and bitter, and stared out the window at the gray sky. He had no idea that in just a few minutes, Emily would say something that would turn this simple meal into a moment he'd never forget. Emily returned to the counter, refilled the coffee pot, and glanced over at the older man by the window. Something about him stood out, not just his age, but the way he carried himself. He had a quiet strength in his posture, like someone who had been through more than he let on. His eyes were tired, but alert. She didn't recognize him, but there was something oddly familiar about him, as if she'd seen that face before in a photo, maybe, or a memory passed down. She thought about it as she plated his steak and added a side of mashed potatoes, just like the cook always did for veterans. It wasn't official policy, but most of the staff agreed. When a veteran came through, you gave a little extra care. When she brought the food to his table, she leaned in slightly to set it down gently, in front of him. He looked up and gave her a polite nod. She hesitated for just a second, her heart beating faster than usual. Something inside her told her to speak, though she wasn't quite sure why. She glanced around. No one seemed to be paying attention. "My grandfather told me about you," she said softly, almost under her breath. James paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "I'm sorry." She took a breath, then spoke just loud enough for him to hear. "Thomas Grayson, my grandfather. He said a man named James Carter saved his life in Vietnam. Said if it weren't for you, he wouldn't have made it home." James blinked, stunned. He hadn't heard that name in decades. Thomas Grayson. The name echoed in his mind like a distant bell. A rush of images filled his thoughts. Dense jungle, gunfire, blood, fear. He remembered dragging a young soldier out of a firefight, shielding him with his own body while bullets whizzed past. He hadn't known if the man lived or died after the medics took him away in war. You didn't always get to find out. "Thomas Grayson," he repeated, his voice low, full of memory. Emily nodded, her voice shaking just a bit. "Yeah, he passed a few years ago, but he used to talk about you all the time. He told me that if I ever met a James Carter, I should say thank you. That I'm here, my mom is here because of you." James didn't know what to say. He stared at her, trying to process what he'd just heard. All these years, he had wondered about the people he'd fought beside, the ones he saved, the ones he couldn't. He had never expected this. The girl in front of him was no longer just a waitress. She was part of a life he had unknowingly helped create. Something in his chest tightened. His hands trembled slightly as he set down his fork. "You're his granddaughter?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Yes, sir," she said, her smile a little nervous but genuine. "He used to show me your photo. It was old and a little faded, but I remember the name. When you said it at the door, I just had a feeling." James leaned back in his seat, staring at the plate in front of him without really seeing it. The sound of the diner faded. For a moment, all he could hear was the roar of helicopters, the shouting of soldiers, the crack of gunfire, and now the quiet voice of a girl who was alive because of a moment he'd almost forgotten. Emily gave a small smile and turned to walk away, leaving James alone with his thoughts and a steak he no longer had the appetite to eat. He didn't know what this moment meant, not yet, but he knew it was important. He'd come in for a meal but found something much heavier than he'd expected. James sat there in stunned silence, his hands resting on the edge of the table as he tried to make sense of what he'd just heard. The hum of the diner faded into the background. The clinking of silverware and low murmur of conversation meant nothing now. All he could think about was the name Thomas Grayson. It wasn't just a name from the past. It was a real person, a kid barely old enough to shave when James had pulled him out of that rice paddy, bleeding and screaming. It had been chaos, the kind of chaos only war could bring. Everything had happened so fast, gunfire cutting through, the airmen yelling, and bodies dropping around them. James hadn't even known the boy's name at the time. He'd just seen a fellow soldier down and did what instinct told him. He ran through fire and dragged him to safety. Then the medics came and took the kid away, and that was it. No thank you, no goodbye. James had often wondered over the years whether that young man had lived or died. But now, decades later, a soft-spoken waitress had just told him that not only had Thomas survived, but he had gone on to live a full life. He had children, grandchildren. Emily was one of them. A life that continued because of something James did in a moment he barely remembered. It hit him harder than he expected. His eyes stung, and he looked away quickly, pretending to focus on the window as he blinked back the sudden emotion. It wasn't like him to get sentimental. He'd learned to bury his feelings deep, to lock them away behind layers of silence and scars. But this was different. This wasn't about medals or uniforms or fading memories. This was about the truth that one choice, one brave act, had reached far beyond the battlefield. It had rippled through time and created a whole new life. He turned slightly to look at Emily as she moved behind the counter, her apron smudged and her ponytail messy from the long shift. She looked so ordinary, like any other young woman just trying to get through the day. But to James, she suddenly seemed like a miracle. He thought of all the men who didn't make it home, all the friends buried in foreign soil who would never know what became of the lives they fought to protect. And here he was, sitting in a quiet little diner, being told that something he did had given a man his future and given this girl her very existence. That knowledge sank deep into his bones. It warmed something in him that had been cold for years. A waitress, a name, a whisper. That's all it had taken to stir the past and bring it crashing into the present. James picked up his coffee again, his hands steady now. He took a slow sip and breathed deeply. For once, he didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel like just another old soldier people politely ignored. He felt seen, remembered, valued, not for anything loud or heroic, but for something real, something that mattered. As he looked out the window at the gray sky turning gold with the first sign of sunset, James realized this day had become more than just a stop along the road. It had become a moment he would carry for the rest of his life. A reminder that even in the darkest times, one small act of courage could echo for generations, and sometimes that echo found its way back to you when you least expected it. James sat quietly, his fingers wrapped around the warm coffee mug as the last light of the afternoon filtered through the window beside him. The steak sat mostly untouched on the plate, but he wasn't hungry anymore, not for food at least. He was full of thoughts and emotions that stirred deeper than he'd felt in years. The warmth of the coffee grounded him while his mind drifted between past and present. He wasn't used to being noticed. In most places he went, people saw an old man with gray in his beard and lines on his face. They didn't see the soldier he once was. They didn't see the sacrifices, the scars he carried silently. But here, in this small, worn-down diner, a young woman had remembered him not from a photo or a plaque, but through a story passed down by a man who had once owed him his life. That kind of connection didn't happen often. As he gazed down at the plate in front of him, he noticed a small, neatly folded napkin resting beside the knife. Curious, he reached for it and slowly opened it. Inside was a note, written in delicate, slanted handwriting. "Your courage gave me life. I hope this meal gives you warmth. It's on the house." For a moment, James didn't move. His throat tightened, and he had to set the note down before the trembling in his hands gave him away. He didn't cry easily, but something about those words touched a part of him he thought had long gone numb. He looked up and scanned the diner. No one stared anymore. In fact, it seemed like the atmosphere had changed since Emily spoke to him. A few people now glanced his way with gentle eyes. An older man near the counter gave him a small nod and tipped his hat, a gesture of quiet respect. A woman in the booth across from him gave a soft smile, like she understood something unspoken. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was real. Something had shifted. Maybe it was Emily's words traveling quietly across the room. Or maybe it was the truth revealing itself in its own quiet way. Whatever it was, James no longer felt like a stranger. He felt seen. He sat there for several minutes, not rushing. To leave, he let himself take in the kindness, the stillness, the unexpected warmth that had filled a place he'd expected to pass through without notice. He finally picked up his fork and took a small bite of the steak. It was perfectly cooked, tender and rich with flavor. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully. It tasted like home, like something made with care. Maybe it was the food, or maybe it was the feeling that came with it. But for the first time in a long while, James felt okay. Not just okay, he felt at peace. He finished his meal quietly, savoring each bite, and when he was done, he placed a crisp bill under the coffee mug as a tip. It was more than the meal cost, but it wasn't about money. It was about appreciation. As he stood up and reached for his hat, Emily approached him again, her eyes soft and steady. She didn't say much, just opened her arms slightly and, without hesitation, gave him a hug. It wasn't awkward or forced. It was real, warm, and full of meaning. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a little shaky. James swallowed hard and returned the hug, patting her gently on the back. "No," he said softly, "thank you," as he stepped outside. The air was cooler, but the sky was clearing. The last rays of sunlight peeked through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the gravel lot. James paused for a moment before getting into his truck, letting the sunlight warm his face. Something had changed in him, something small but powerful. He came in for a meal, just another stop on a lonely road, but he was leaving with something far greater, a sense of purpose he thought he had left behind long ago. James stepped out of the diner and into the fading light of the evening, the sky above washed in soft shades of orange and blue. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he walked slowly toward his old pickup truck. He paused beside it, hand resting on the driver's door, and looked back at the little building, the flickering sign, the fogged windows, and the worn-out screen door that now held a memory far more important than anything he expected when he arrived. Inside that diner, in just under an hour, something had shifted inside him. He had walked in hungry for food and left full of something he couldn't quite name: gratitude, peace, maybe even healing. It had been years since he felt like what he did all those decades ago mattered. Most people never asked. The war had been a ghost he carried alone, tucked away behind a polite smile and weathered hands. But that girl Molly had brought that ghost out into the open, not with questions or pity, but with truth, a name, a memory, a note. Her hug still lingered in his chest, soft and full of meaning. It wasn't just kindness, it was acknowledgement, and it meant more than she probably knew. James climbed into the truck and sat for a moment, the engine off, the silence surrounding him like an old friend. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a small, faded photo, one he kept with him always. It was a black and white shot of his old squad, taken during a brief moment of calm in Vietnam. There, among the young faces, was Thomas Grayson. James stared at the photo, really looking at it for the first time in years. He gently traced his finger over Grayson's face. "You made it," he whispered, "and you told her. Thank you." He smiled, a rare, deep smile that reached all the way into his eyes. Carefully folding the photo back into its place, he started the engine. The truck rumbled to life and he pulled onto the quiet road, heading west toward nothing in particular. But now, the road didn't feel so empty. Every mile stretched out ahead of him like a gift, a quiet promise that he still had time to remember, to be remembered, and to carry this story forward. As he drove, he passed rows of fields and small houses, each one glowing gently, and the dusk he thought of Emily's face, of her saying she was alive because of him. That truth struck him over and over again in waves. All those nights he had wondered if what he did mattered, if anyone remembered. Those doubts were answered in a single encounter, tucked away in a roadside diner. He didn't need a parade or a medal. That moment was enough. It was real. And as the stars began to show in the darkening sky above, James felt something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. Not the kind that came from silence, but the kind that came from being seen, being valued, being understood. His heart felt light, and his thoughts were calm. He wasn't just driving anymore, he was moving forward. Finally, carrying with him a moment that stitched the past to the present with grace. And as the diner disappeared in the rearview mirror, James Carter smiled to himself. The road opened before him, his story quietly closing a chapter he didn't even know was still waiting to be written. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Subscribe to The Black Struggle for more powerful stories that honor truth, history, and heart.